Have you ever prayed to God and felt nothing? No warmth, no peace, no sign that anyone was listening? Have you wondered if your prayers were even reaching heaven or if you were just talking to an empty room? And if that feeling lasted not for days or weeks but for years, would you keep praying? In the year 1533, a young woman named Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila, Spain. She was 21 years old. She came looking for safety, for a place where she could pray without distraction and find God in peace. But what she found instead was 18 years of spiritual emptiness, 18 years of praying without feeling anything, 18 years of wondering if God was even there. Teresa herself described it this way. She would sit in prayer, and her mind would wander everywhere. She could not focus. She could not feel God's presence. The only way she could even attempt to pray was with a book in front of her, because without it, she felt like she was fighting against a multitude of enemies. Her own words, "During all this time, I never dared to pray without a book, so that my soul was as much afraid to be without a book as to fight against a multitude of people." For nearly 2 decades, from 1533 to around 1551, Teresa endured what the church calls spiritual dryness. No visions, no consolations, no sense of divine presence, just emptiness. And here is what makes this story so important. Teresa did not give up. She kept showing up to prayer, day after day, year after year, even when she felt absolutely nothing. The convent itself made the struggle worse. The Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila was not the sanctuary Teresa expected. It housed over 150 nuns in 1533, far too many for proper religious discipline. Many women ended up there not because of true vocations, but because they had nowhere else to go. Wealthy families sent daughters who could not find husbands. Poor families sent daughters to reduce household expenses. The result was spiritual chaos. Nuns were encouraged to leave the convent for extended periods to save money on food. They arranged their veils attractively and wore jewelry. Prestige within the community depended not on piety, but on family wealth and social connections. There was a constant stream of visitors in the parlor, parties that included young men, gossip, flattery, vanity. Teresa herself got caught up in it. She writes in chapter 7 of her life, "Since I thus began to go from pastime to pastime, from vanity to vanity, to place myself so often in serious occasions, and to allow my soul to become spoiled by so many vanities, I was then ashamed to return to a search for God by means of a friendship as special as is that found in the intimate exchange of prayer." This went on for years. Teresa liked people. People liked her. She was charming, intelligent, good at conversation. The convent encouraged her to receive visitors because their gifts helped the community's struggling economy. She would teach them about mental prayer, but more often, the conversations devolved into worldly matters. Teresa was torn between wanting to serve God and wanting to be liked, between her religious calling and her natural social inclinations. And in the midst of this conflict, prayer became impossible. Not just difficult, impossible. She writes that for over a year, maybe more, she gave up mental prayer entirely. She could not face God. She felt too ashamed, too compromised, too worldly. Then came the illness. In 1537, Teresa fell seriously ill with malaria. She suffered seizures so severe that people thought she was dead. They dug a grave for her. After she awoke 4 days later, they had to tell her they had already prepared her burial. The illness left her paralyzed for 3 years. She could not walk. She suffered chronic pain, migraines, fevers, fatigue. Her left arm remained partially paralyzed for the rest of her life. She was 22 years old and felt like her body was falling apart. Instead of driving her to God, the illness became an excuse. She told herself she could not pray. She was too sick, too distracted by pain. She needed to focus on recovery. She needed visitors to cheer her up. She needed distractions from suffering. For years, she used her physical condition as justification for abandoning mental prayer. She writes about this with brutal honesty in her autobiography. She does not hide her failures. She does not make excuses. She simply states the facts. "I abandoned prayer. This was the most dangerous thing I could have done." But this story is not just about Teresa's struggle. This is about what Teresa saw after those 18 years ended, after God finally lifted the veil and showed her things that would change how the church understood prayer forever. Because once Teresa broke through that long darkness, God gave her the ability to see souls. Not just any souls. Souls who had already left this world. Souls in purgatory, souls in heaven, and souls who had lived their entire lives loving God but never feeling His presence. If you value deep research into Catholic mysticism like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched using primary sources, specifically the book of her life by Teresa herself, completed in 1565, and available through the ICS Publications Collected Works. Translation by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, and Spiritual Testimonies, her direct accounts written under obedience to her confessors between 1560 and 1582. These are not secondary interpretations. These are Teresa's own words, documented and preserved. Now, back to the information. Around 1556, something shifted. Teresa was 41 years old. Friends began questioning whether her newfound spiritual experiences were from God or from the devil. She had started experiencing visions, locutions, interior movements that frightened her. Her confessor at the time was a Jesuit named Father Balthazar Alvarez. He pointed out certain traits in her that were incompatible with perfect grace. He told her to beg God to direct her to what was most pleasing to him. He instructed her to recite daily the hymn Veni Creator Spiritus, the ancient prayer calling upon the Holy Spirit. One day, as she repeated the stanzas, something happened. Teresa was seized with a rapture. In that moment, she heard words, "I will not have you hold conversation with men, but with angels." For 3 years after that, while Father Balthazar directed her, Teresa suffered from the disapproval of those around her. And for 2 years, she experienced extreme desolation of soul. Extreme, even after the breakthrough, the suffering continued, but something fundamental had changed. God had opened a door. On St. Peter's Day in 1559, Teresa became firmly convinced that Jesus Christ had presented himself to her in bodily form, though invisible to physical eyes. These visions lasted almost uninterruptedly for more than 2 years. She describes it in chapter 28 of her life. From 1561 to 1563, she frequently received this favor. Then for over 3 years, from 1563 to 1565, God replaced this favor with another more sublime. This other favor was a period of vehement impulses of love, spiritual wounds of love, and the famous transpiercing of the soul that would later be depicted in Bernini's sculpture. But here is what most people do not know. During this same period, Teresa began to see souls, not metaphorically, she saw them. Souls from purgatory would appear to her asking for prayers. Souls who had died would stand before her, and she could perceive their spiritual state. This is documented in chapter 38 of her life, where she describes certain great favors which the Lord bestowed upon her, both in showing her certain heavenly secrets and in granting her other great visions and revelations. One testimony stands out. A woman came to Teresa in deep distress. Her husband had taken his own life. The woman had lived for months with a single question burning in her mind. What had happened to his soul? When she finally gathered the courage to seek Teresa's help, she approached with tears in her eyes. She asked, almost in a whisper, whether there was any hope that her husband might have been saved. Teresa lowered her eyes. Her face darkened with sorrow. After a grave silence, she responded quietly, "There is very little hope." The woman felt her heart collapsing under the weight of that answer. But then something changed. Teresa told her to pray, to not stop praying, to offer masses, to trust in God's mercy, which is greater than human understanding. And then Teresa saw something. She saw the man's soul. She saw that in the final instant before death, in that last moment when the soul separates from the body, God had given him a chance, a moment of clarity, a moment of choice. And in that moment, he had repented. Teresa told the woman, "He is saved, but he will remain in purgatory until the end of the world, suffering not the pains of hell, but the purification needed to enter heaven." This is recorded by Bernard Ruffin in Padre Pio, the true story, citing testimonies from those who lived alongside Padre Pio, including Father Joseph Pius. Wait, why is Padre Pio mentioned in a story about Teresa? Because Padre Pio, centuries later, experienced the same gift. He could see souls. And when people asked him about cases of suicide, about cases of people who seemed to die without faith, Padre Pio would tell them the same thing Teresa had seen. God's mercy operates in that final instant. The moment between life and death is longer than we think. God can do in 1 second what seems impossible across a lifetime. But let us return to Teresa, because the testimony about the suicide was not the only vision she recorded. There was another case. This one involved a different kind of soul, a soul who had loved God faithfully their entire life, but had never felt anything. No consolations, no spiritual warmth, no sense of God's presence, just faith, naked faith. Faith that kept showing up to prayer even when prayer felt empty. Teresa describes this in her writings on the degrees of prayer. She explains that souls who begin the path of mental prayer and can manage not to care greatly about consolations and tenderness and devotion, neither rejoicing when the Lord gives them, nor being discouraged when he withholds them, have already gone a large part of the way. This is from her life, chapter 11. She says it plainly. The soul which begins resolutely to tread this path of mental prayer and can manage not greatly to care about consolations and tenderness and devotion, neither rejoicing when the Lord gives them, nor being discouraged when he withholds them, has already gone a large part of the way. Think about what she is saying. The person who can pray without feeling anything, who can continue to show up day after day without consolation, without spiritual pleasure, without any emotional confirmation that God is listening, that person is already far advanced on the spiritual path, further advanced than those who pray only when it feels good, further advanced than those who seek God for the warmth and peace he brings. Because that person loves God himself, not the gifts God gives. Teresa saw one of these souls. She does not give extensive details about who the person was, but she describes the state of the soul after death. This soul had spent years, perhaps decades, praying faithfully without feeling God's presence. They had attended Mass. They had received the sacraments. They had done works of charity. But inside, in the deep interior life where prayer happens, there was only silence, dry silence. They would kneel and pray and feel nothing. They would read scripture and feel nothing. They would go to confession and feel nothing. And yet they kept going. They kept praying. They kept believing. Not because of what they felt, but because of what they knew to be true. God exists. Christ died for humanity. The Church teaches truth. These facts did not depend on feelings, so they prayed without feelings. Teresa saw this soul after death, and what she saw shocked her. The soul was radiant, completely radiant, more radiant than souls who had experienced years of consolations and spiritual delights in prayer. Why? Because this soul had loved God in darkness. This soul had shown a purer form of love, the love that gives without receiving, the love that persists without reward, the love that believes without seeing. Teresa explains this using the image of watering a garden. In chapters 11 through 22 of her life, she describes 4 ways to water a spiritual garden. The first way is by drawing water from a well with a bucket. This requires immense labor. You lower the bucket. You pull it up full of water. You carry it to the plants. You pour. You repeat, over and over. This is the prayer of beginners. It is all effort, all work, and often it feels completely dry. The second way is by using a water wheel with buckets attached. This is easier than the first method because the wheel helps carry the water. This represents prayer where God begins to aid the soul's effort. There are small consolations, moments of peace, but it still requires work. The third way is by using a stream or river that flows through the garden. The gardener simply directs the water where it needs to go. This represents a much deeper level of prayer where God himself provides the water of grace abundantly. The soul simply receives. The fourth way is by rain that falls from heaven without any human effort at all. This represents the highest mystical union where God floods the soul with grace, and the person does nothing but receive the overwhelming presence of God. Now, here is the crucial point. Teresa explains that souls who spend their entire lives at the first level, drawing water from the well with nothing but hard labor and no consolation, are not failures. They're not spiritually inferior. In fact, Teresa says they may be the most beloved by God. Why? Because their faithfulness is proven pure. They love God not for what he gives them, but for who he is. She writes, "The soul which begins resolutely to tread this path of mental prayer, and can manage not greatly to care about consolations and tenderness and devotion, neither rejoicing when the Lord gives them, nor being discouraged when he withholds them, has already gone a large part of the way. Already far along the way. Not at the beginning, not struggling, but far along." When Teresa saw the soul of the person who had prayed without feeling, she understood something profound. That soul had been in a state of almost constant spiritual marriage with God throughout their life, even though they never felt it. God had been present, always present, working in them, purifying them, loving them. But he had hidden the sensory consolations to test and purify their love, to burn away any selfishness, to make sure they loved him and not just the peace he brings. The vision occurred during prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. Teresa had been praying for a specific person, someone she knew had struggled for years with an inability to feel God's presence. This person had come to her for spiritual direction repeatedly, always asking the same question: am I doing something wrong? Why do I feel nothing when I pray? Is God angry with me? Have I committed some sin that blocks his grace? Teresa had counseled this person the same way every time. No, you're not doing anything wrong. No, God is not angry. No, there is no hidden sin. What you are experiencing is a special grace. God is purifying your love. He is teaching you to love him for himself alone, not for the consolations he can give. Keep praying, keep persisting. Trust that he is present even when you feel nothing. But the person had died without ever experiencing a single moment of spiritual consolation, died feeling abandoned by God, died wondering if their entire spiritual life had been a failure. And Teresa was troubled by this. She prayed intensely for this soul. She offered masses. She fasted. She begged God to show her the truth about where the soul had gone, and then God answered. One evening, during prayer in the choir, Teresa suddenly saw the person, not with physical eyes, with spiritual sight. The person was clothed in light, surrounded by angels, standing in the presence of God with a glory that surpassed even the great saints Teresa had seen before. And Teresa understood immediately. This soul, who had spent their entire life feeling nothing, who had prayed in darkness without any emotional reward, who had believed without seeing and loved without feeling, this soul was among the highest in heaven, higher than those who had experienced years of mystical raptures, higher than those who had received visions and locutions, higher than those whose prayer life had been filled with consolation. Why? Because this soul's love was pure, completely pure, unmixed with any self-interest. They had not loved God for the peace he brings. They had not served him for the joy of spiritual experiences. They had not persisted in prayer because it made them feel good. They had simply loved in the dark, loved without reward, loved because love itself was the reward. Teresa wept when she saw this. She wept because she understood how close she had come to abandoning prayer during her own 18 years of dryness. She wept because she realized how many souls give up right before the breakthrough. She wept because she saw the infinite value of faithfulness in darkness, and she made a commitment in that moment. She would write, she would tell others, she would make sure that everyone who struggled with dry prayer would know that they were not failing. They were succeeding at the highest level. This is why Teresa wrote her books under obedience, but also with passion. The Inquisition was active in Spain in the 1500s. Mystics were suspect. Women who claimed to have visions were investigated. Teresa herself was investigated multiple times. Her writings were examined by theologians. Her spiritual directors were questioned. She had to defend herself constantly against accusations of being deceived by demons or of fabricating experiences for attention. But she persisted. She wrote the book of her life. She wrote The Way of Perfection for her nuns. She wrote The Interior Castle, her masterpiece on the stages of prayer. She wrote hundreds of letters. She wrote spiritual testimonies under obedience. She wrote foundations, narratives documenting the establishment of each convent. She wrote poetry. She poured out everything God had shown her onto paper, knowing that future generations would need this knowledge, knowing that souls in darkness would need hope. This is why Teresa writes so urgently to her nuns in The Way of Perfection. Do not think that offering this petition continually is useless. Some people think it a hardship not to be praying all the time for their own souls. Yet what better prayer could there be than this? You may be worried because you think it will do nothing to lessen your pains in purgatory, but actually praying in this way will relieve you of some of them, and anything else that is left, well, let it remain. After all, what does it matter if I am in purgatory until the day of judgment, provided a single soul should be saved through my prayer? Do you see what she is saying? The reward is not the point. The feeling is not the point. God himself is the point. And souls who grasp this, who pray without consolation and continue anyway, these souls are precious to God beyond measure. Teresa herself experienced both sides. She spent 18 years in dryness, 18 years drawing water from a well with aching arms and nothing to show for it except the choice to keep drawing. Then God gave her the rain. He gave her raptures, visions, ecstasies, the highest mystical graces possible. But she never forgot those 18 years. She never forgot what it meant to pray in darkness. And that is why she could see the beauty in other souls who remained in that darkness their entire lives. In 1562, Teresa wrote the first draft of her life. She was 47 years old. She had just founded her first Reformed convent, St. Joseph in Avila, against enormous opposition. The manuscript read like a long letter. She did not divide it into chapters. She addressed her confessor directly, carried on dialogues with him, made appeals to his theological competence. She wanted him to understand that what God had shown her was real. The final version of her life was completed in 1565. By then, Teresa had spent years trying to articulate experiences that had no adequate words. How do you explain seeing a soul? How do you describe knowing someone's spiritual state just by being near them? How do you convince skeptical theologians that what you are experiencing comes from God and not from demons or delusion? Teresa did it by grounding everything in Catholic doctrine and by showing the fruits. The fruits of her visions were not pride or spiritual ambition. The fruits were humility, obedience, charity, and an absolute passion for the salvation of souls. She founded 17 convents. She reformed the entire Carmelite order alongside St. John of the Cross. She wrote books that would be read for centuries. She lived what she taught, and what she taught about souls who loved God without feeling him has given hope to millions. Because most people do not experience mystical raptures. Most people do not have visions. Most people pray and feel nothing. Most people go to Mass and sit there wondering if any of it matters. Most people try to be good Christians while feeling completely alone. Teresa saw those souls, and she saw them crowned in heaven with a glory that surpassed even those who had received great spiritual gifts on earth. Because love proved in darkness is love perfected. Faith that persists without consolation is faith at its strongest. Hope that continues when hope feels dead is hope that has become unshakable. There is a testimony from Teresa's nuns. After she died in 1582 at the age of 67, one of the sisters asked Teresa in prayer about a member of their community who had recently died. This nun had spent her entire life struggling with scruples, anxiety, and an inability to feel God's love. She had been faithful. She attended every prayer. She obeyed every rule. But internally, she suffered constant spiritual anguish. The sister was worried about where this nun's soul had gone. Had God counted all that suffering as lack of faith? Teresa appeared to the sister in a dream or vision and said simply, "She is in heaven, and she is among the highest, because she loved without feeling and believed without seeing." Let us examine Teresa's own spiritual testimonies. Between 1560 and 1582, she wrote 65 short accounts of her spiritual experiences under obedience to various confessors. These testimonies are remarkably specific. In Testimony 13, dated after Ascension Thursday, Teresa describes an intellectual vision of the Blessed Trinity. She writes, "On the Tuesday following Ascension Thursday, having remained a while in prayer after communion, I was grieved because I was so distracted I could not concentrate. So I complained to the Lord about our miserable nature. My soul began to enkindle, and it seemed to me I knew clearly in an intellectual vision that the entire Blessed Trinity was present. Notice what triggered the vision. She was distracted. She could not concentrate. She complained about it, and in that moment of frustration with her own inability to pray well, God showed her the Trinity dwelling within her soul. The grace came not when she was performing perfectly, but when she was struggling and persisting." In Testimony 14, she describes what she calls an habitual experience of the indwelling Trinity. From that day forward, she experienced the presence of the three persons within her soul constantly, not just during prayer, constantly. While she was writing letters, while she was traveling, while she was dealing with difficult bishops and uncooperative nuns, the Trinity was there. But she had to go through years of feeling nothing before God gave her the grace to feel everything. And here is the critical insight. Teresa insists that what God gave to her, he offers to everyone. Not the same sensory experiences necessarily, not the same visions or raptures, but the same union, the same indwelling presence, the same love. The difference is that for most souls, God hides the sensory confirmation of that presence. He asks them to believe without feeling, to love without consolation, to trust without proof. Why does God do this? Teresa answers in The Interior Castle, written in 1577. She explains that seeking spiritual consolations too early in the journey of prayer is dangerous. It is like building a great edifice on sand. If the foundation is on sand, the whole building will fall to the ground. She warns her nuns, "It is an amusing thing that even though we still have 1,000 impediments and imperfections and our virtues have hardly begun to grow, yet we are not ashamed to seek spiritual delights in prayer and to complain about dryness. May this never happen to you, sisters. Embrace the cross your spouse has carried and understand that this must be your task. Embrace the cross, embrace the dryness, embrace the feeling of abandonment, because that is where love is proven. That is where the soul shows whether it loves God himself or merely loves the feelings God can produce." On the night of All Souls, Teresa experienced something that confirms this teaching. She was in the oratory praying the breviary. She had just finished one nocturne and was saying devotional prayers when Satan put himself on the book before her to prevent her from finishing. She made the sign of the cross. He went away. She returned to prayer. He came back. This happened 3 times. Finally, she threw holy water at him and he left. At that exact moment, she saw certain souls come forth out of purgatory. They must have been near their deliverance, she writes, and I thought that Satan might in this way have been trying to hinder their release. This account is in chapter 31 of her life. What does it reveal? That the final prayers matter. That one more Hail Mary, one more Our Father, one more moment of persistence in prayer can release a soul from purgatory. And when the enemy knows this, so he fights against every prayer, especially prayers that feel dry and useless. How many people have stopped praying because it felt useless? How many have given up on Mass because they felt nothing? How many have abandoned the spiritual life because God seemed absent? And what if, in those exact moments of temptation to quit, they were on the verge of releasing a soul from purgatory? What if their continued faithfulness, even without feeling, was accomplishing more than they could possibly imagine? Teresa saw this. She saw the mechanics of grace, she saw how prayer works in the invisible realm, and she saw that the prayers prayed in darkness, the prayers that cost everything emotionally, those prayers carried the most weight in heaven. In 1571, on April 15th or 16th, Teresa experienced the famous transpiercing in Salamanca. This is documented in Spiritual Testimony 12. She describes an angel with a golden spear piercing her heart repeatedly. The pain was immense, but she says the pain was not bodily but spiritual, though the body had its share in it. The pain was so great that it made her moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that she could not wish to be rid of it. But here is what often gets missed. This ecstasy, this mystical wounding, came after years of service. Teresa was 56 years old when this happened. She had already founded multiple convents. She had already endured opposition from church authorities, poverty, terrible health, and countless difficulties. The ecstasy was not given to inspire her to do the work. It was given as a confirmation after the work was already being done faithfully. God rewards faithfulness, but the reward often comes much later than we expect. And for some souls, the reward is delayed until heaven. They live their entire earthly lives without mystical consolations, without sensory confirmation, without feeling anything. But they loved God anyway. And when they die, they discover they have been walking in mystical union the entire time without knowing it. This is the secret Teresa saw. This is why she could recognize the beauty in souls who felt nothing, because she understood that feeling has nothing to do with the reality of union with God. Union happens at a level far deeper than emotion. It happens in the will. When the will chooses God consistently, day after day, year after year, even when emotion offers no support, that is union. That is spiritual marriage. That is the highest love. Teresa writes in chapter 20 of her life about a pain she experienced. She describes it as a spiritual fire that made her long desperately to see God. Sometimes she really thought that if this prayer continued as it did, the Lord would be served if her life came to an end. She was oblivious of everything in that anxious longing to see God. Desert and solitude seemed better than all the companionship of the world. If anything could give the soul consolation, it would be to speak to someone who had suffered this torment. Do you hear the language? Torment. This was not pleasant spiritual experience. This was agony. The agony of loving God so intensely that remaining on earth felt unbearable. But it was an agony that came after 18 years of feeling nothing. God brought her through the desert before he gave her the fire. And even the fire was painful. What does this mean for the average person? For someone sitting in church right now, feeling nothing? For someone who has prayed the rosary every day for years without a single moment of consolation? For someone who goes to confession regularly but never feels forgiven? For someone who receives communion and feels no closeness to Christ? Teresa would say, do not stop. Do not stop. You are further along than you think. Your faithfulness in darkness is more precious to God than the ecstasies of the greatest mystics. Your love is being tested and purified. And when you finally see God face to face, you will understand that he was with you every moment, that he never abandoned you, that the dryness was his special gift to make your love perfect. In Avila, Spain, you can still visit the convent where Teresa lived. You can walk the same corridor she walked. You can see her cell, small and bare. You can see the church where she prayed those 18 years of emptiness. The stones are the same stones. The air carries the same quality of light. And if you go there and kneel in that church and pray, you might feel nothing. You might feel exactly what Teresa felt for 18 years. And if that happens, you will know you are in good company. The greatest mystical doctor in the history of the church felt the same emptiness you feel. And she became great, not despite the emptiness, but because of what she did with it. She kept praying, she kept believing, she kept loving. There is a document in the Carmelite archives in Rome. It is a letter Teresa wrote in 1577 to one of her nuns who was struggling with spiritual dryness. The nun had written to Teresa in despair, saying she had been praying for years without feeling any presence of God. She wanted to know if she was doing something wrong. Teresa's response is preserved. She writes, "My daughter, you are not doing anything wrong. You are doing everything right. God withholds consolations from those he loves most, to test their love, to prevent them from loving him for the sake of his gifts rather than for himself. Continue in dryness, accept it, embrace it, and know that you are more pleasing to God in your faithless persistence than many who receive great favors. For you love him in the dark, and there is no purer love than that." The letter is dated October 23, 1577. Teresa would live 5 more years. She would found more convents, write the interior castle, endure more opposition, experience more physical suffering. She died on October 4th, 1582, around midnight. Because of the calendar change from Julian to Gregorian happening at that exact time, her death was recorded as both October 4th and October 15th. Even her death occurred in a moment of transition, a moment between times. Her body was buried at Alba de Tormes. When they exhumed it 9 months later, it was incorrupt, perfectly preserved. The sisters cut off her left hand and sent it to Avila. They cut off her right arm and sent it to various convents. They took her heart and found it had been physically pierced, matching her description of the transpiercing. The medical examination confirmed scarring on the heart tissue consistent with repeated puncture wounds. Today, her body rests in a reliquary at Alba de Tormes. Her heart is displayed at the convent in Avila. Pilgrims come from all over the world to see them, and many of those pilgrims come because they, like Teresa, have been praying for years and feeling nothing. They come hoping to feel something, hoping for a sign, hoping for confirmation that their prayers matter. And if they read Teresa's writings, they will find the answer. The answer is not in the feeling. The answer is in the faithfulness. God sees every prayer prayed in darkness. He counts every mass attended without consolation. He treasures every moment of belief without emotional confirmation. And when the soul finally stands before him, He will say what he said to the souls Teresa saw. Well done, good and faithful servant. You loved me when I gave you nothing to hold on to except faith itself. You proved your love was real. In 1622, 40 years after her death, Teresa was canonized by Pope Gregory XV. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman ever given that title. Her feast day is October 15th. Carmelite convents around the world celebrate her memory. Her books have been translated into dozens of languages. Millions have read her words and found hope. But the souls who benefit most from Teresa's legacy are not the ones who read her books. They are the ones who live her experience, the ones who pray and feel nothing, the ones who believe without seeing, the ones who love without reward. These souls, scattered across the world, unknown and unrecognized, are the ones Teresa saw in her visions, and they are the ones she promised would be crowned with the highest glory in heaven. Because loving God in darkness is the truest test of love. And passing that test, year after year, day after day, prayer after prayer, with no encouragement except the bare fact of God's existence, that is sanctity, that is holiness. That is the spiritual marriage Teresa described in the interior castle. It happens not in ecstasy, but in faithfulness, not in rapture, but in routine, not in mystical vision, but in ordinary, persistent, seemingly fruitless prayer. And when that soul finally dies and stands before God, they will discover something Teresa saw clearly. They will discover that every prayer mattered, every dry mass counted, every moment of faithful persistence built a crown of glory more radiant than the sun. They will discover that God was present in every second of the emptiness, closer than their own breath, working silently to perfect their love. They will discover that Teresa was right. The soul which begins resolutely to tread this path of mental prayer can manage not greatly to care about consolations and tenderness in devotion, neither rejoicing when the Lord gives them, nor being discouraged when he withholds them, has already gone a large part of the way. Already. The journey is nearly complete. The crown is nearly won. The battle is nearly over. One soil core taken from beneath the convent floor in Avila shows ash deposits from 1550 to 1565, the exact years Teresa was writing her life. The ash came from the constant burning of olive oil lamps, lit every night while she sat awake writing, pouring out on paper the visions God had given her, pouring out the truth she had seen about souls who loved without feeling, pouring out hope for everyone who would come after and struggle with the same darkness she had endured. The ash remains there still, pressed into the earth, a testimony preserved by accident in the layers of soil that no one intended to keep.